Hello, welcome to Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii. And I'm your host, Hong Jiang. And today with me in the studio are my guests, Wendy Miles and Bryan Bushley, both PhD candidates from UH Manoa. And today we're going to be talking about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through REDD+. Just a little bit of background. A couple weeks ago, we had a session about forest laws. And today we'll be talking about the opposite, basically forest protection, and try to understand how it's related to global climate change and challenges of protecting forests on the ground. In this case, is in Indonesia and Nepal. And I have to say that new PhD students, or those who are about to finish their dissertation, are those producers of new exciting knowledge. And we have two of them today in our studio. And welcome, Wendy, and welcome, Bryan.
Thank you.
Okay, so a couple weeks ago, we were talking about Indonesia and forest deforestation implications of that. And today, I'm glad we're talking about the other side, putting the forest back. And in terms of forest and global climate change, the connection clearly, people out there, our viewers would all understand, forest holds the carbon in its stock so that it doesn't release it to the air to add to global greenhouse gases to warm up the climate. And one data I saw was deforestation or forest destruction accounts for about 17% of global greenhouse gases. So forest plays a very, very important role. And this project, it's a global project called REDD, and that's helping to protect forests in different parts of the world. So tell us a little bit about what is this REDD, R-E-D-D?
The acronym is Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And then the plus, it deals with co-benefits, and that would be anything from biodiversity conservation to livelihoods. And then the emissions, of course, is the greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon from deforestation.
So in other words, it's not just to protect forests, but also about protecting forests in the context of maybe regional development, sustainable development, in that kind of line, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. And I guess you both work with the implementations of REDD program in different countries, and you work in Indonesia and you work in Nepal. And give us a kind of an example of how this REDD project is implemented in different countries.
Okay, well, I'll start by talking a little bit about Nepal. So just quick background. So REDD is really about developed countries investing in forest conservation in tropical developing countries. And we'll see in just a moment a visual of that.
Let's just bring the visual. Producer, can you bring the first map? So the first map now is, can you explain the first map just a little bit?
Yeah, so looking at the map, basically, you see some orange circles and some green circles. And the orange circles represent the funding countries, those who are investing, putting money into REDD and trying to make it happen financially. And the green countries represent those who are receiving those funds and trying to implement projects on the ground, basically for forest conservation. And as you can see, most of the orange countries are located in sort of the global north, or developing countries.
The richer countries.
Yeah, and most of the green countries are in tropical developing countries.
Oh, mostly tropical?
Mostly tropical.
I see,
yeah.
That's interesting. So your work is in Nepal to see through one of the projects that...
Right. So when people think about Nepal, actually, they don't often think of it as a tropical country, perhaps, right? Sort of has this vision of snows and the Himalayas, and that's true, but Nepal also has a considerable amount of its territory, which is lowland, tropical, subtropical forests. And so there are several REDD projects going on there, and I've been there as a researcher, so not directly involved in the implementation of any one project, but I've worked closely with a few different projects to kind of understand the process of what they're trying to do, and sort of from both the national and the community level. And so, in essence, Nepal is a very geographically diverse place. So we have mountains, and it ranges in elevation from about 100 feet to 29,000 feet at the top of Mount Everest. So there's a huge diversity of different forest ecosystems as well, and a huge diversity of kind of threats to forests in different places. And so most of the deforestation is happening in the lowlands and kind of the lower to middle hills regions in Nepal. And
is that where the RED is implemented?
Most of the RED projects are also there, yeah. So there's kind of a fit between that, obviously. And so basically we have different countries like Norway, the US, UK, Switzerland, Finland, who are all investing in these projects in Nepal. And we also have kind of international NGOs that are implementing these projects, and local civil society organizations who are involved in different ways. And of course the government is kind of coordinating this effort and trying to coordinate these different projects in a way that it can manage it.
So it's very involved, involving very different kinds of managers and stakeholders.
Yes.
Not just the government involvement, but also local people and NGOs as well.
And the one perhaps, maybe not unique, but significant thing about Nepal is that they have a very prominent community forestry program, or it's basically a program where they've handed over national forests to local communities to manage. And this is really what the focus of most of the RED activities is working with these communities to implement it.
That's interesting. So we'll learn more about it as we continue with the discussion.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about Indonesia.
Indonesia is receiving an incredible amount of attention in RED, and for good reason. It is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in terms of land use change and deforestation of any country. So this is the type of mechanism that, if it could work, it could make a really big difference for a country like Indonesia and its emissions levels. There's a variety of different threats. One of the most known ones is palm oil conversion, so deforestation that then gets converted to palm oil plantations. And Indonesia is the #1 palm oil producer in the world. Now, Indonesia also happens to have the largest and deepest peatlands, specifically tropical peatlands in the world. And as those are converted to other land uses, and as they're drained, they dry and they become highly flammable. And this is what causes famous forest fires in Indonesia that we've had every single year, but some years have been particularly exceptional, such as 1997. Visible from outer space.
We hear a lot about the Indonesian forest fires.
Right, and in that particular year, they estimated that those emissions just from forest fires in Indonesia and deforestation, it was somewhere between 13% and 40% of the global emissions. That's total, with all types of emissions. And then this year, they made news in June with the Singapore Haze, which again, it was affecting several different countries in Southeast Asia, as it does almost every year. And so that is CO2 going directly into the atmosphere.
That's right. You can actually smell it.
Yeah, and feel it. Your eyes burn.
That's right. Yeah. Producer, can we bring the second map and then flash to the third map? Because I just want to show people where the two locations are in terms of our discussion today: the Indonesia and Nepal, and the next one. So this next one, explain a little bit about this next.
So what you see with this image is the areas that have the largest carbon stores in terms of forest specifically. And you'll see areas such as the Amazon, also the Indonesian archipelago, and the Congo are really important in these regards.
So both Indonesia and Nepal are showing the red colors.
They are.
And that's making both of your work very, very important. You spoke about the developed countries putting in money to basically fund the tropical developing countries to preserve their forests. I have two questions. One is, maybe this is a easy to answer kind of question. Like, why would developed countries put in money for it, and what would encourage their commitment to put in money for it? So that's one thing. And the well, let's have you answer that one, and I'll go follow.
That's a very good and important question, Hong. I think there are a variety of reasons, actually. One of them, though, is that there is kind of a global, international effort to address climate change. And developed countries are perceived as being largely responsible for climate change in terms of their energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, there's sort of a moral obligation on the one hand, but there are also legal obligations through international treaties that have been formulated through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change specifically, and the Kyoto Protocol, which came out of that, and which actually set targets for developing countries to meet in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And so many countries are striving to meet those targets, and RED is sort of a relatively newer but important part of doing that.
When did RED start?
2008 is when you started seeing movement on the like within these countries towards this, and right now we're still in the pilot phase, so it hasn't officially started.
So 5 years still in pilot phase?
Yeah, there's a lot of groundwork that has to be covered in terms of the institutional understanding, and even the mechanics of how you measure carbon.
Both Indonesia and Nepal are chosen because both countries are having the forests being threatened. Are there other kind of criteria that enable both countries to be selected?
One, I think that's the most obvious reason, is that forests in Indonesia and forests in Nepal are severely threatened. In fact, both of them are kind of in the top 10 in terms of forest loss over the past couple of decades, in terms of the proportion of forests that they have lost in their respective territories. So that's a very primary concern. But there are, I don't know the exact number, but I would say at least 40 countries around the world where RED projects are being implemented, or that are kind of trying to promote and implement RED.
I'm glad you answered the question first, because Indonesia, clearly has to be chosen because of what Wendy just said about the impact and everything, and it's also a larger area with a larger tract of forests.
And the amount of attention different countries are getting, it does vary. So a country like Indonesia, they now have 50+ RED-related projects that are being initiated. And according to my estimates, over $1.4 billion that's been invested.
Wow. So we're going to take a quick break. And this is Hong Jiang. This is with Asia in Review. And we've been talking about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through the RED Plus project. And when we come back, we'll learn more about it. Thank you.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Hello, we're back. We're live, and this is Asia in Review, and I'm Hong Jiang, and we've been talking with Wendy Miles and Bryan Bushley about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through the RED project. So we were just talking about how RED came about, And I know both of you had significant research experience on the ground to see how REDD was working in each country, and we'll get to that. But in general, what do you see as major challenges of forest protection, keeping the forests in these two countries?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of challenges that really apply to many of the countries that are trying to implement REDD. And one of the biggest challenges probably is the level of funding for REDD currently, or the lack of funding for REDD, some might say.
So those rich countries are not giving enough money, so to speak.
Precisely, yeah. So there's been estimates that that we need up to $1 billion a year in order to make this mechanism really effective. And since 2008, about $4.5 billion has been designated for REDD, but a much smaller amount has actually been dispersed to projects.
Just a small drop in a whole big
yeah.
bucket.
And it varies by country, of course. So some countries have received much more than others. And Nepal actually at present, I think, has received about $4 million for their, officially kind of for their REDD readiness activities, but there's some other projects coming online now that will augment that. So that's one of the challenges, is how do we ensure kind of a lasting, sustainable source of funding for these types of projects and for the REDD mechanism in general. And there's a big debate also about the type of funding or financing that is appropriate to REDD. And we can talk a little bit more detail. Well, I'll just briefly say, so there's kind of this distinction between a fund-based and a market-based approach to REDD. And fund-based means that it's largely funds that are being channeled from different countries. And market-based means that actually private investors are involved in funding, and that we're creating an actual real market for carbon offsets. And so many of those who are criticizing, saying there's not enough funding, say that we need to leverage that private market
Maybe
more.
toward the end we can explore that a little bit.
Yeah.
There's also an issue within these countries, because as we mentioned, REDD is targeting developing countries, but developing countries, on the one hand, they have the concern of their forests and forest conservation, but on the other hand, the development, they're developing. And so this needs to be a priority as well. So in a country like Indonesia, President Yudhoyono, he made a commitment for a 26% reduction in greenhouse emissions by 2020, 41% reduction with help internationally. But the same year, he made the commitment, and it's a good commitment, for a 7% growth rate every year.
Oh, how does the two work together?
And so this is really difficult, balancing the two, especially for a country whose economy is so dependent on its natural resources.
So in reality, maybe only the economic commitment gets implemented and not the commitment to reduce carbon. I just wonder.
It's going to take a lot of work to do both.
Yeah. So we definitely see, just in terms of general, environmental protection, and there are a lot of challenges, especially in terms of trade-off with economic growth. That's a major challenge in the developing world. Let's get to your field. I'm excited, anxious to know more about both of your fields. And in terms of where you were. Give us examples of your particular REDD project, because we talk about forest protection. Where did the money go to do what? Okay,
I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in Nepal, I actually went there first time in 2000. Well, I was there in 2009 when the REDD activities kind of started in Nepal, and there are several research sites, or several project sites in Nepal for REDD, but I was focused mainly on one project that's working in 3 different watersheds in Nepal, and in different districts. So 2 of them are kind of in the hills, and 1 is in the lowlands, the Terai, they call it. And so these projects took, I say, a fairly holistic approach, and they were really focused largely on REDD readiness. So basically, coming in, explaining to the communities what this new program was, providing support in terms of educational campaigns, talking about important issues related to it, such as how do we actually address kind of not cutting down the trees, or how do we promote conservation?
So it's almost like a lot of educational kind of work.
A lot of educational work up front, in this case, and then they actually implemented. But along with that, there was measurement of the forest. So trying to assess how much carbon stock there is in those 3 sites, and along with that, some sort of basic social and economic baseline studies to determine what the communities look like, what types of people, the profile basically of these communities. Because another aspect of REDD, besides kind of looking at just the carbon benefits of it, is what are the implications for kind of social and environmental issues and aspects.
So by now, the money hasn't been put into the forest yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually this is one characteristic of kind of REDD in Nepal, is that so within the context of that pilot project, they made some payments to the communities, but as a pilot project, so not directly linking it to an international buyer or an international market or funder, but within the context of that specific project, they made some kind of performance-based payments. And it was interesting in Nepal because they did it based on both the carbon amount, but also with significant consideration of these social factors, like the number of indigenous people living in the community, the number of different ethnic groups. Caste is an issue in Nepal, which is a social stratification of people. So these other factors came into account in this sense. Yeah.
So it's really in a kind of piloting kind of stage still.
Yes, very much so in Nepal, and so there haven't actually been any carbon credits issued.
Okay.
So this is when we talk about REDD and the offsetting and carbon markets. What we mean is that specific credits are issued to buyers who are investing in these projects to promote conservation.
That's when you were talking about moving into a market-based kind of a mechanism.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or maybe, market-based, but also when we talk about offsets in general, we say we're offsetting our carbon emissions by investing here, and we're getting a credit as recognition of that.
What about Indonesia?
So, as I mentioned, there's quite a few projects in Indonesia that are going forward. But the one that I looked at when I arrived there for my fieldwork in 2011, I wanted to choose the most innovative REDD Plus pilot project I could find, something that was really cutting edge. And so I chose the Kalimantan Forest and Climate Partnership between Australia and Indonesia. And that also involves the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation and CARE International, and the World Bank had intended to also become involved. So it was a 4-year pilot project with the expectation that it would be extended. It is in central Kalimantan in very deep peatlands and involves 7 different communities along the Kapus River. And so in that particular project, you found that actually half of the project area had been completely deforested and burned. And the other area was a reserve for orangutans. And the work there, the primary goal when you take the essence of it was to prevent any more forest fires and these emissions that would result from that. And so there was a lot of work, technical work, and then also social on the social side and economic. And they were, even though it was fund-based, they were working on involving economic mechanisms in terms of payments to local communities, and really trying to get a feel for what REDD will be like as it evolves and if it becomes a mechanism, an international mechanism. But the fact that it was still fund-based meant that it is still dependent on the priorities of the countries providing funding. So when Australia's international priorities shifted from climate change, which was a major priority of AusAid in Indonesia a few years ago, to dealing with the issue of asylum seekers, then that aid also shifted, and the project is being closed down in the coming year.
I see. So we were talking about the challenge in terms of funding and also stability of funding and continuing commitment is an issue. So when Australia funding, was it completely withdrawn or just reduced?
It was, there's a small amount, an extension of 1 year, a small amount to wrap it up.
So in a way that, you know, they gone in there, really didn't see any long-term effect of their funding.
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
And these communities are so squeezed. Between, in the north, you have forest preservation. On other sides, you have palm oil coming in. And before you had red, but red would have potentially been a way that they could have increased their rights to local land, and also could have potentially been a way that they could have another source of income.
Wow, so we immediately see the challenges here. The project is both moving slow, 5 years still in piloting kind of stage, and then funding instability and not a long-term commitment from the donors, basically. Talk about other challenges.
Well, I wanted to mention actually that one other aspect of kind of forests and forest governance in general in Nepal is that there's a kind of a split between the two regions, the hills and the Terai or lowlands. And many people believe that split has a lot to do with the sort of history of community forestry, which I mentioned before, which was implemented largely in the Middle Hills originally. And as a result, we have forests that were quite severely threatened back in the kind of late 1970s, early 1980s, that have been handed over to communities, and many of them have been revived. Okay, many of them have been brought back to a more rich forest state, you can say. And in the lowlands, we have still, we have relatively less community forestry and a lot more pressure on the forest in terms of timber harvesting, conversion to agriculture, and other kind of what we might call drivers of deforestation. And also kind of less effective governance in many ways of those areas. So while a lot of the success stories of kind of reforestation in Nepal has been in the hills region, the plains are still very much under threat. And one of Nepal's concerns actually in this whole red debate is how do we get recognized for the conservation that we have done up to this point. And actually, so some of the people that I've talked to in Nepal who work in international organizations, government, they say that Nepal was actually played a kind of a key role in getting red to become Red Plus. Because
in terms of engaging the community, looking at other economic or sustainability issues.
So that's one part of the Red Plus, but another aspect of the Red Plus is, so red was originally designed as kind of a mechanism to stop deforestation.
Okay.
But the other aspect of Plus is to basically revive some of those forests.
Including reforesting, is that
including to some extent reforestation. So what the term that they use is enhancement of forest carbon stocks as that part of the Plus.
So the credit Nepal is searching for, is it to get carbon credit for what they've already done?
They would like to get that, yeah. And so there's this actually a kind of a more technical issue of what they call the baseline, the historical baseline for when you start counting the deforestation from. And so there's been a lot of discussion about what the appropriate historical baseline should be in Nepal and in other countries too, I think.
It's time for us to take another break, and when we come back, we'll learn more about the Indonesia experience. Again, this is Asia in Review, and I'm Hong Jiang, and we'll be talking about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal.
I'm Bill Spencer, President of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
Hello, we're back, we're live, and this is AJ in Review from ThinkTech Hawaii. And we've been talking with Wendy Miles and Bryan Bushley from UH Manoa about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through the RED program. So before the break, we were just talking about additional challenges of this, putting conservation of forests in Nepal. What about in Indonesia? In addition to the funding instability, other challenges that you see?
There are. So one of the challenges that through the years people have been concerned about is this concept of leakage. So you are conserving carbon in one area in this within this RED project, but then whatever activities would have occurred there are then occurring somewhere else, and the emissions are still going into the atmosphere.
So in a way that you're putting forests here, or preserve forests in one place, but in other places you put out more carbon.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
called the leakage, right?
That's the leakage, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so now we're getting to observe this actually beginning to happen, instances of this. And so one example is Indonesia's STAR pilot province for RED Plus, Central Kalimantan. And it has had, it has many RED Plus projects in the south focused on the peatlands, understandably because that's where a huge bulk of the carbon is. But a lot of the virgin rainforests are in the north. And what we have happening right now is because the MP3EI, this is their national development plan, it's moving forward. And part of that plan are these new economic corridors, one of which goes through Central Kalimantan. Mm-hmm. And so they're in the process of, they're going to build a railway that goes from northern Kalimantan all the way to the port in the south. Mm-hmm. And it's specifically designed for the exporting of coal. At a large scale, upwards to 49.7 million tons of coal per year.
Is this a new coal mine?
This is all
that's going to be opened up, and
it's all being opened up and developed as we speak.
And so that means forest is cut on top of it, right?
Yeah, and this is all kind of getting more attention at the moment. Demonstrations have started on the ground with local people and with environmental activists. But this would, when you consider, I mean, Indonesia is now the #1 exporter of coal in the world. And this will increase its ability to export by, it's almost 50 million tons per year, and right now they're about 300 million tons per year exporting. So, and it kind of, it's a concern, and it makes you question the pilot province and whether whether those RED projects are even able to offset their own emissions within that province.
I guess the country and the economic sector of the country, the decision makers are probably going to be saying, well, we have this coal mine, this is going to make us a lot of money. We're not going to forego this coal mining development. And at the same time, because they did promise to reduce carbon, I wonder, did they have any plan to put the forest back somewhere so that it can offset the forest reduction in the coal mine area? This is just not even discussed right now.
That remains to be seen. There has not been an impact assessment yet on an environmental impact assessment on this railway level.
That's interesting. We'll wait and see. Producer, can you put up the next photo? Yes. You talk about peatland. I want to have you talk a little bit more about the peatland.
Yeah. So this is an image from near my field site. But this is what it looks like during musim kabut, during the smoky season, which happens every year in Kalimantan. And this is from the fires. It gets to the point that the Kapus River where I lived, you couldn't see across the river on certain days because it was so smoky, and would actually, it was almost like snow. The ash would fall down midday. So this is what Indonesia is trying to address.
So the peatland, basically it's developed under forest when you have a good water condition and you have a long time kind of accumulation of carbon stock.
Absolutely.
Underneath.
This is swampland, and so it's all, if you can imagine, thousands of years of trees, debris, leaves, fallen, and all the carbon they store is almost encapsulated within time and held within time under the ground. And when it's drained and when it lights on fire, that is all that storage from many years past is let go into the atmosphere.
Wow, so that's even more important than the underground forest.
It is. It's actually, and this is what makes RED contradictory in and of itself, just the acronym REDD, because emissions from deforestation. But if we go where that's based on tons of carbons, but if we go where we can conserve the most tons of carbon, we're actually going to look below ground.
That's
at
right,
the
yeah.
peatland, not above ground. And that's why I think these areas get prioritized over the virgin rainforest in the north, for example, because if we're just calculating it based on those tons of carbon and the money and the donor dollars that will equate to, that's where you would go.
So it'd be better for them to go to the peatland and try to protect that carbon stock in comparison to try to preserve the on-the-ground forest and put the money in there, basically.
And that's important, and biodiversity conservation are important. They're both important. I think that it's a matter of knowing what our priorities are and strategically planning accordingly.
Yeah, and sometimes bureaucracies, UN project included, are bogged down by these terms. We're dealing with forests, and forests is more popular, and everybody know about forests and peatland. What is that? Yeah, but just one, if you could explain. So these peatlands are burning every year because of what? Human activities?
Human activities is what ignites it, but once they're ignited, oftentimes they're too difficult to put out.
And they are burning every year seasonally?
Every year seasonally, and so what determines whether it's going to be a really bad year for the fires or not has to do with the weather itself. How long of dry season is it?
Wow, that's just amazing. I think our viewers would want to know more about this. And Bryan, you wanted to add more about some of the experience you have.
Yeah, actually just to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and I think this relates, I'll talk about it in the context of Nepal, but I think it relates to Indonesia and other places, and when Wendy mentioned this kind of the peat lands and the tropical forest and kind of the mismatch between those, or the contradiction in terms of conserving them, and this sort of above ground versus below ground carbon, that gets to another really fundamental issue for REDD, and that is the issue of who owns the forest, who owns the trees, and who owns the land where they're planted. And this is a crucial issue in most countries, I think, for implementing REDD in an effective way. And I think there's, in a lot of countries, there's a question. This is still a big question, including in Nepal. So Nepal, as I mentioned, has a system of well-established system of community-based forest management. They have now almost 18,000 different groups that are managing forests around the country. So it's significant. It's the largest kind of civil society organization in the country. And they have specific rights to the forest, but they do not own the land, that the forests are grown on. And as in Indonesia, and as in most countries in Asia, most of the land is owned by the government, by and large.
So is the concern that when the REDD money comes in, who's going to benefit from it, right?
Right, exactly. So there's this, so what happens in Nepal is that they have typically a 5 or 10 year lease on the land. But there's kind of no guarantee that those leases will be renewed. And so there's a lot of concern about the government kind of trying to claim those rights and benefit more from the carbon vis-a-vis the communities.
So now, especially if the money is coming in from the top, then government might use this as an excuse to take over the rights to use the land. If that's to happen, that is a huge concern, I'm
right.
sure.
It's there's definitely potential for that. And there also is a discussion that I believe actually has taken place in Indonesia, but I don't know the result of that. Maybe you can elaborate. But it hasn't really happened in Nepal in terms of who benefits from REDD. And this issue is also very closely tied to land tenure and what we call carbon rights. Who owns the carbon. And so how do we ensure that the communities benefit, but also who else should get some benefit from that? Should the government get a cut, basically, of the carbon for kind of facilitating these projects, et cetera? Or should the like a private developer play a key role?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, those are important questions. So we're going to take a short break, and I'm Hong Jiang. This is Asia in Review, and we'll be talking about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through the REDD program. And when we come back, we'll learn more about it, especially what's the future of the REDD program.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
Hello, we're back, and we're live. This is Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii, and I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we'll be speaking with Wendy Miles and Bryan Bushley from UH Manoa about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal. So right before the break, we were talking about more of the challenges. Now 5 years into the project, and most places the implementation is still in the piloting stage. Where do you see this RED program going? Is it going to take off? Is it going to continue? Or what do you see the future? Look like for more challenges?
In each of our countries or in general?
Maybe both. Talk about in each of your countries first.
Well, I'll just say very quickly about Nepal. So one of the factors about kind of RED in Nepal is that it is very much fund-based now. So it's driven by donor organizations that are funding these RED readiness activities, they say, but no real carbon offsets have occurred. And the government is not engaging with the private sector in any significant way. So there really isn't any private investment in Nepal in RED. So at the global level, there's still a lot of debate as to what form RED should take. Should it be more of a market-based approach, or should it be more of a fund-based approach? And if it goes towards the sort of market-based approach, then Nepal will face a steeper learning curve, or they'll be a little bit behind on things, I think, because they haven't engaged with that yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, I think they're also dealing with some of the same issues that Bryan just mentioned in terms of the learning curve. But I think also they have a very good, in terms of national players within RED in Indonesia. They also understand the risks and the uncertainties of RED. And so what I see is people using this as a mechanism to accomplish other goals that they have, or more overarching goals. So even if RED does not succeed, it does not mean that it didn't make a positive impact, because it is being used, for example, for the One Map project in Indonesia, where they're trying to remap and organize all of the different data on the landscape across the archipelago so they can better manage it. And they're also trying to improve issues, like they're working on issues of corruption in forests, and they're working on overall improving forest governance and building that infrastructure and those institutions. And so in that sense, I think that RED is making positive impacts, regardless of what its future might be.
So it's almost like it is not that much money, but it is a seed. It can be playing a role of leveraging, helping in terms of addressing other larger issues related to forest management, or larger, maybe even economic issues. Yeah.
So I think, I think that's a very good point. And in Nepal, I would say it's similar. It's that this project, or this program, RED, has galvanized so many different actors kind of in the process, and including like very prominent civil society organizations, like federations that represent these community groups, Federation of Indigenous Nationalities that's been very active in the RED debates and implementation as well. And so it's kind of led to a lot of discussion and debate about forest governance in general, and some positive steps, like Wendy has said, and maybe sort of a seed for improvements. But I think the longer term question is, will this seed continue to grow? You know, if the RED mechanism basically doesn't happen, or doesn't happen in the long term. I think.
What's interesting is that I also wonder whether through RED, you were both talking about the educational role of RED project, talking to local people, talking with them about their local management of the resources. So whether it would also encourage the developing countries themselves to take on more of a challenge and responsibilities to protect the forests. If that is to happen, then I think that's probably a more important direction that RED can go.
Yeah. And in Indonesia, that is what I think we are seeing to an extent, we'll continue to see it. I mean, Indonesia is in an interesting position in that, unlike countries like the Maldives or Bangladesh that have very little sway in their fate in regards to climate change, Indonesia does. They are a major player in the fight against climate change. They're almost ground zero in places like Kalimantan.
That's right.
And they are also a country that'll be severely impacted potentially by climate change because it's an archipelago of islands.
So raising more awareness and taking more of a leading role, basically, in terms of forest protection. Yeah. And one thing I read, just looking at RED is a program that is global, and it is important part of global climate change kind of I guess strategy coming from the UN. And I saw some discussions linking it with a green development or low carbon development, linking RED with these kind of development paths. Do you see that as a possibility? Direction that it could move to?
I see it as a necessity.
Okay.
In terms of the issue of leakage that we talked about earlier. And you can't only address deforestation because, yes, that is 17% of the global carbon emissions. It's a critical percentage. But there's the, 4/5 is from other sources. And so we have to be addressing it all at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree that it's a necessity. We can't have sort of a forest conservation project going on over here while we have either trees been cut down over here or kind of vast emissions from another source. So some way, if RED is going to be kind of a successful part of a strategy to fight climate change, it has to be integrated with these other activities. And it has to be scaled up, I think, in different countries. And in Nepal's case, that means it has to move beyond just these community forestry groups to other kind of types of land use, and it has to be more all-encompassing, I think. And that's a significant challenge that lies ahead, too.
So look like we'll have to watch out to see where RED is going in the next few years. Yeah. Well, we're out of time, and we'll have to wrap up. And I'm Hong Jiang, and this is Asia in Review. And we've been talking with Wendy Miles and Bryan Bushley from UH Manoa about forest protection in Indonesia and Nepal through the RED program. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And in educating us about what this RED program is doing and all the challenges that it faces. And I want to acknowledge the credit to Aulia Alanga, who provided the photo for today's video backdrop. And I want to thank to the ThinkTech production team, and especially our producer, Jay Fidel, who magically puts everything together. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in. And I'll see you next Tuesday at Asia in Review. And thank you. Goodbye.